Am I okay? Yeah. So I don't have any slides, and as Leslie mentioned, I'm not really representing IES. I'm sharing my experiences as a grantee. My disclosure is I do have a cooperative agreement, a research and development center that is ongoing, and I've reviewed on the past, but don't sit on a study section currently. Joan McLaughlin was in communication with the foundation and is really sorry that she couldn't come. The Institute of Education Science has two different sections that do support the kind of research that we do. And I've had some conversations with Joan McLaughlin, who's the commissioner of the National Center on Special Education Research, about her perspectives on where implementation science kind of fits into their portfolio of grants. So I'm going to share some thoughts about that. In addition to the National Center on Special Ed Research, there's also the National Center on Education Research. Turns out they have a lot more money than the special ed research folks, and that's why Joan isn't here, for lack of funds. And as some of you know, NCSR did not run a competition this year. They have a backlog of fundable grants from the previous year. The hope is that that situation will improve. And there is an announcement that will be coming out shortly. So there will be a competition for NCSR this year. The current director of IES, the Institute of Education Sciences, is John Easton. And he succeeded Russ Whitehurst, who was the founding director of IES, which has been going on for, what, about 10 years? Maybe somewhere in that neighborhood. And what Russ Whitehurst did was really focus on the rigor of science around education sciences. And when John Easton came on, his perspective was to maintain that priority on rigor, but add to it a priority on relevance. And it's because of that priority on relevance and thinking about feasibility and usability that Joan thinks that this is a really good time to really sort of be focusing on implementation sciences. One of the ways in which his interest has been reflected is in some new competitions. There have been researcher-practitioner collaborations. One of the mechanisms has been kind of a planning grant where researchers were supposed to collaborate within educational settings around what the issues were in those settings, what were some of the characteristics of those settings, the constraints within those settings that related to educational outcomes. These are 2-year planning grants that are $400,000 over 2 years. The idea here is that at the end of the 2 years, people would be, this collaborative team of educators and researchers would apply for a research grant. And we'll talk about some of those mechanisms in the goal structure for IES briefly in a second. In addition, they have continuous improvement grants that are 4-year grants that are $2.5 million. So for already established collaborations, this larger mechanism is also available that would be quite relevant in terms of implementing educational practices, evidence-based practices that will improve the outcomes for students. Both of those are situated in the National Center for Education Research. So if I turn to more of a focus on on NCSR, the National Center on Special Ed Research, they have a goal structure, and I think the assumption was that most people doing research in educational settings would already know about IES and have familiarity with the goal structure. So I'm going to mention it briefly, and we'll refer you to the IES website and the upcoming RFP, which will probably look a little different from a couple of years ago when the NCSR announcement was last released. The first goal is exploratory. It's kind of wide open, and in many respects, oftentimes it's using existing data, published databases, and so forth that could involve implementation issues. But we really didn't get into that too much in our conversation. But when it comes to Goal 2, which are the development and innovation grants, really the idea is that developers will end up with something that will really drive implementation. There's focus and some definitions in the RFP for usability, feasibility, and fidelity. The idea is that at the end of a development and innovation or Goal 2 project, the products that would be produced are fully developed treatments for the end user in academic settings, in educational settings. So it could be a curriculum. In addition, there would be supplemental training materials, other kinds of materials that might support implementation of that curriculum or a set of strategies. The idea is that the research component of the development and innovation projects really kind of focus on this iterative development process. So oftentimes single subject designs are a mechanism within that that development process, leading up to a feasibility study. So the feasibility study needs to include measures of fidelity because that is really a critical piece kind of going forward to the subsequent goal structure. The idea is in the final year to do some kind of a pilot project in an authentic educational setting. Oftentimes that serves as a basis for providing some preliminary data on effect sizes for Goal 3 studies. What Goal 3 studies include are efficacy, replication, and follow-up. Those could be viewed separately in terms of what it is that they're willing to fund. There are fewer efficacy applications and funded projects than there are development and innovation projects. But the idea is that these mechanisms are supposed to build on one another. So you have to have demonstrated feasibility through a variety of approaches that were discussed around over the last couple of days, through the single subject designs, through focus groups, through your pilot studies, and what have you. The idea here is that for the efficacy trials, they want to know not only if they're beneficial, but trying to understand why they're beneficial, what kinds of organizational supports are necessary for them to optimize educational outcomes. And if the effects are not all that beneficial in terms of producing improved educational outcomes, trying to figure out what the source of the problems are, with the idea that at least there should be some preliminary evidence that the treatment should have some positive effects associated with it from prior work, but that there may be other barriers or restrictions and things that we've been talking around implementation science. So I think it's really important to think about the significant sections of these projects really focusing on implementation, while the research plan really focuses on how you're going to collect information that will inform the implementation of these various approaches. Replication studies can be based around existing strategies, programs, curricula, what have you, that could be extended to a new population. It could focus on how to improve implementation. So there is some flexibility around these replication studies. In the new announcement that's coming out, there is going to be a new requirement around the focus on fidelity and how important they view measurement of fidelity early on in the process, so that if fidelity is compromised, that you don't continue to do your randomized control trial the way it was originally planned, but that you fix the problem, which obviously presents a few challenges around your research design. But the idea is to identify those problems early on in the process. How that's going to be described in the RFA that comes out, I'm not exactly sure, but she assured me that that is a particular concern. Now, the goal 4 mechanism really focuses on scale-up and implementation and effectiveness, I'm sorry. And I think that what you want to emphasize is that obviously implementation science is really critical there, that what she was afraid that people might not be aware of is how seriously implementation is taken in the applications for the Goal 2 and Goal 3 projects that lead up to those effectiveness trials and those scale-up projects. I am going to refer you to the IES website for more information about the mechanism, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I imagine there are some other IES-funded investigators who could also help with that as well. I wasn't supposed to be up here by myself, but my compadres left early this morning, so.
It's awful dark. Howard, can I ask you, Howard?
Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question while you're getting set up? So this type of funding opportunity, would like training of clinicians in implementing clinical practices, as well as training of, let's say, mild traumatically brain injured wounded warriors in preparing them to return to school, would these types of projects be appropriate for the IES?
So
So
for which population?
So it's two different populations.
Yeah.
It's educating providers, speech pathologists, who are then training, instructing in applications for returning to school for wounded service members or mild traumatic brain injured vets and active duty service members who are returning to maybe a community college level or academic setting.
So I know that the Office of Special Ed Programs and Rehab Services has had a focus on higher ed, and I assume still does. I'm not sure that IES does, okay. But maybe somebody else. I mean, it's really early childhood through grade 12, I believe. And maybe transition. There has been a focus on transition in the past, but I don't actually think that would be viewed as a priority. In terms of training folks, there has been within some of the announcements, there's been a focus on the quality of training and special focus areas in that, but and specifically on research on the quality of training and how to improve educators' implementation of evidence-based practices. Steve?
Hey, Steve Camerata at Vanderbilt. Thank you so much for that. It's extremely helpful. So there was an initiative there was a competition last year for these mentored, they're like Mentored Scientist Awards. They had a different name for them. And my understanding is they're going to do that again, and it's
the Early Career
Yes,
Awards.
the Early Career Awards, yes.
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe, given that there's early career people in our audience, that maybe if you know something about that, you might comment on it.
Well, I actually reviewed for those the first time they went around, and I think similar to K Awards, in NIH, there's you have to have both a research plan and a training plan, and both of them have to be well thought out and well supported. So I think that the people who didn't really have a very good training plan didn't fare very well in that competition. So I think that, you know, paying close attention there is really important. I wasn't sure, Deb Spees really focused on the early career awards, the prior commissioner for NICSR. So I hadn't heard whether they were going to do that again. So I'm glad to hear that there is an opportunity to, for people to apply for those early career awards.